Nice to meet you all. Thanks everybody for coming here this morning. I know it's the second day, so things are a little bit tougher. Just really wanted to cover my view from Achilles' perspective on CSRD and CSDDD and its impact on supply chains and procurement. So I'm not really here to sell anything from my perspective. I spent 15 years as an auditor, so my view is from the ground, having seen cases of child labour and human rights abuses actually in the supply chain in different parts of the world. So I think what we see at Achilles that's changed massively certainly over the last few years with the introduction of some of the legislation, is how important you stakeholders are within an organisation as procurement experts. So historically, when I started back in 2010 with Achilles, procurement was kind of seen as a process that organisations had to go through, and it wasn't necessarily always respected within businesses in terms of the importance of it. It was seen as a gateway or a challenge to deliver certain projects or to provide certain materials and so on. But actually, as a result of the legislation, there's been a massive change and shift in the way that you as professionals are seen within your organisations, and you're much more important now that people have started to realise it, because actually you hold the key in the insight into the risks and opportunities that are associated with your supply chains. And with the legislation, you're also the ones that are going to have to increasingly try to engage with your supply chains at the first tier, hopefully getting on beyond that, but there's no silver bullet as much as people would like to tell you in terms of collecting some of that information. So everybody in the room here is a vital part in supporting the compliance that comes from reporting under the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and CSDDD, if and when these things get introduced into legislation after the omnibus edition and the discussions we're having at the moment. And so the reason it's really important, particularly with CSRD and the importance of the procurement function, is that when we start to think about the impact that your organisation has on the planet or on people within the supply chain and within the community, but also how your supply chain, how people in the planet impact your organisation's sustainability and performance. When we speak to organisations, 9 times out of 10, the biggest challenges that they face are the challenges within their supply chain. I can go to most multinational companies and I can look at their policies and procedures. I can get a fairly good understanding of all of the great records and documentation that they have, ISO certificates, everything like that, and that's fantastic. But when you start to ask organizations how they're addressing issues within their supply chain and what they're trying to do, this is where the real challenge lies. And this is why the procurement function, 9 times out of 10, is the most important function to go and speak to in the first instance, because they hold the keys in terms of understanding where some of these risks might lie and also where some of this impact is that's associated with the company as a whole. And so to give you an example, when going to certain organisations, often when I speak to them, you might go and speak to their HSEQ team or something like that, but they're only focused on their own activities. It's when you go and speak to the procurement team, or you go and speak to sustainable procurement teams as there are now, that you start to really get an understanding of what an organisation is actually doing, not just what their policies and procedures are saying that they do. And so when we think about procurement professionals within an organisation, effectively they're the gatekeeper, or they are the main port of call when it comes to supporting that compliance. And the reason that they are, and the reason you are, is because without you collecting information and addressing some of the issues within the supply chain and identifying those issues, your corporate teams aren't going to be able to report anything. As much as they might like to think so, without you going out and carrying out all of that legwork, without you guys picking up the phone or logging into various systems, however it is that you do it, you aren't going to be able to collect the right information to support people like me now or others within your organisation. They're going to have to report on this stuff. They're going to need to report on scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. They're going to have to report on issues around human rights or labour abuses within the supply chain. They don't know how to get that information because they don't know who the supply chain is. They're relying on you all to collect that. And so for organisations, there needs to be a shift in terms of the way that the procurement function is being seen, to see them as that gatekeeper into where all of that knowledge lies, because it really does. The knowledge lies within the supply chain, and the knowledge lies within an organisation, within the procurement function. And we need to get to a point then where we can balance the need for quick access to products, materials and services, or the commercial requirement to cost, along with the ethics that are associated with those products and materials. And I don't need to kind of go on about it today, but you only have to Google supply chain issues and you'll see hundreds of articles associated with environmental issues, human rights issues, health and safety issues. And so, again, your information helps to guide those decisions higher up the chain, so to speak, when it comes to stakeholders, the board of directors, because without your information, it's impossible for others to go and report that back to allow for additional resource, additional money, additional time to carry out some of these checks. So we have to balance between wanting the products and services that we need, that we have to have to support the solutions or the services that we provide to our clients, along with the responsibility that we have to ensure that those supply chains are safe, ethical and responsible. Because again, if you're a category manager, like the category manager that I was with when we saw children working in a factory in China, and knowing that those products were going to be going into the EU market, you don't want to be having that conversation with your boss to report back to them, because it's not a great situation to be in. On the right, you can see the OECD approach to risk-based due diligence. So I've changed it slightly so it covers some of the things that Achilles does, but effectively there's 6 stages in a lot of these things, and the most important ones that I want to mention is really around the identification of risks, or impacts, risks and opportunities if we're thinking about CSRD. And so again, you as an organisation, or you as individuals within your organisation, you are the ones that directly impact and can support that risk assessment, because you know where things are being bought from, you know what kind of products and materials that are associated with different issues. And if you can collect that information and present that back to your teams, it makes it much easier to start to identify specific parts of the world or specific products or materials that you may then need to focus your time and energy on. Because as much as it would be great probably for most of the organisations that are in this building to say that you can go out and assess all of your suppliers, and we're going to go down to the nth tier, and Adam's going to go out and audit everybody and it's going to be excellent for everyone, that isn't real. That's not a realistic way of operating, and it doesn't happen. That's why risk-based thinking to due diligence and risk-based thinking to procurement is the way that you can start to address and identify specific suppliers, specific industries and specific materials or services that do present a greater risk to you. And they're the ones that you focus your time and effort on. They're the ones that need to be monitored, you need to engage with or communicate with and report on their performance. I think one of the biggest issues associated with the legislation and the talks about the legislation at the moment, certainly with CSDDD, is the burden. And it was the same with the Lieferkettengesetz when it was introduced here in Germany, is that burden on suppliers and burden on the organisations. But if organisations are looking at things in a risk-based way, there shouldn't be huge amounts of additional burden if that risk assessment is done effectively and you as stakeholders have been engaged to identify who some of those high-risk suppliers might be. Burden comes when consultants and other companies come out and say, right, you're going to audit all of your suppliers and there's risk everywhere. There's not risk everywhere. If that was the case, I'd kind of be walking around wearing hemp clothes, and that's not what I'm doing right now. So it's about identifying specific risk areas and focusing on those first and then moving forward from there. One of the issues in terms of assessing a supply chain when you start to look at it in terms of, right, we need to go across the board, thinking about all suppliers, is that actually, if you've not carried out that risk-based approach, you're never going to start drilling down into the areas that you really do need to focus on. And so I could go out and carry out an assessment of a supplier, ask all kinds of questions, but that's a local supplier providing sandwiches or something like that. Whereas, you know, the organisation that's producing the kit or the equipment that I'm wearing in a Malaysian factory that's using a high amount of migrant workers. That's where I should be spending my time and effort to understand what they're doing. And so when we build out, or when professionals start to build out what their pre-qualification or what their assessment looks like, it's about trying to manage the amount of questions that are being asked of those suppliers, because otherwise we get into this kind of fatigue mode for suppliers. And to be honest, and you probably know better than I do, they're not going to answer the questions. They're not even going to respond to you. They're not going to engage. And so really finding ways that you can encourage organisations to engage by demonstrating a much more specific approach to the due diligence processes that you as organisations have is one way that you can start to build up some of that knowledge to support those organisations from a risk-based due diligence thinking. So I always quite like this image on the right-hand side, and I think it's relevant not only just to greenhouse gas emissions, but it's also relevant to an organisation when it comes to supply chain risk from a human rights perspective. I won't dwell on this slide too long, but there's some statistics there on the left-hand side. But actually thinking about that risk there and then flipping it on its head and ensuring that you're carrying out the assessment on the highest risk suppliers to the greatest depth and ability that you have as an organisation is vital to ensure that you're providing the information back from a reporting perspective. And so once you've collected all of that information, it's about, well, what can we do to provide an example to our organisations in terms of actions that they can take away to the sustainability team, the health and safety team, the compliance team. Without the knowledge or the information that you're providing them through the checks that you're undertaking, these organisations or these individuals within your company aren't going to be able to support. So it's all about trying to collect the information that can educate internally on the first and foremost, because without internal education, you'll never get the time or the money or the resource to implement the changes that you want to or the processes that you want to. And so whenever, again, you go and speak to people within your team, providing them and demonstrating the checks that you've undertaken, providing the stories back to them and providing them with the information that ensures that they have an accurate understanding of the risk within your operations makes it much easier to start to push those stakeholders to provide you with more support. And when we come to look at resilient supply chains, so we collected all of this information in, we started to address some of the issues that have been identified, and that's great. But it's then starting to look at, well, where do we actually want to start focusing time and effort? Because if you start going out and spending loads of time effectively being wasted quite often, asking questions of certain suppliers or in certain parts of the world, you're not really going to get anywhere in terms of your approach. That information that you provide back to your board of directors or back to your compliance teams isn't going to be effective, and it's not going to drive change, and that change isn't going to help you, and not having that change is not going to help you, and it's certainly not going to help your organisation when it comes to compliance later on down the lines, particularly if you then start to identify greater risks later on. So developing supplier roadmaps or improvement plans is vital. Incorporating things into contracts if you can to encourage that engagement. I understand that's difficult. And then tracking the performance of some of those suppliers within the supply chain and encouraging and educating them. One of the organisations that I worked with for some time, again on modern slavery issues in the UK, they would often go out with me when we could conduct visits of suppliers because they wanted to demonstrate that it wasn't just they weren't just the stick. They wanted to explain why they were also the carrot in terms of the opportunity that would come if they were going to be more engaged in improving how they were operating as an organisation. So tracking trends, identifying suppliers to work with, and then engaging with them is critical to ensure some form of buy-in from those organisations. Otherwise, they see you as a burden, and it's fine, that they'll, as long as you keep paying them for the work, that's great. But we don't want to get to a position where everything becomes a tick box because nothing changes, and we see the same old things happening again and again and again. So just leave it on this slide here in terms of a couple of examples of where I think things can be improved. So think about the sustainability-related legislation, incorporate best practices into your business, and see yourselves as the key people in responding to supply chain risk. engage both with your internal stakeholders and with your external stakeholders, your suppliers, to support them and your organisation, not only in compliance, but in improving what you do as an organisation. And I'll leave it there. Thank you. If you have any questions, I think I've run out of time now, but if you do have questions, Achilles are on B69 at the back of the hall, and be happy to talk to you a bit more. And there are some people that can sell stuff there as opposed to me. So, yeah, thank you very much.